She froze in the doorway, napkin folded in her hand, because one mistake here could end an invitation forever. What got you banned was stricter and stranger than anyone remembers. The house was in a brand new subdivision, the kind going up by the thousands after the war, and the dining room was the one room every family fought to furnish first. A whole etiquette culture bloomed almost overnight to teach women who had never hosted a formal meal in their lives exactly how it was done. And getting it wrong in front of the wrong guests was not a small embarrassment. It could follow a young couple for years. Developments like the one going up outside Philadelphia in 1951 could turn a bare field into thousands of finished homes within a single year, and every one of them shipped with a dining room nobody's grandmother had trained them to fill. For the first time, an ordinary family could own the exact stage a formal dinner required, without the faintest idea of the script that was supposed to go with it. Rule 1. And it came before the food, before the flowers, before anything else. If an invitation arrived and you did not respond within a few days, you had already insulted your hostess, because she could not plan a single dish until she had her exact count. The ritual was never written down as law, but every good hostess knew it by heart, and every guest who ignored it was quietly never invited back. Think about what that head count actually controlled. The size of the roast, the number of chairs pulled from the hall closet, the chafing dishes she would need to borrow from a neighbor down the street. A silent guest was not being modest. She was quietly forcing another woman to guess. And guessing wrong meant either an embarrassing shortage or wasted food on a grocery budget that mattered. A hostess built her evening like a small piece of theater, timing the roast to come out exactly when the last guest walked in. If you arrived even 10 minutes late without a phone call first, you had thrown off a schedule she had been managing since 2 that afternoon. Lateness was not read as casual then, it was read as a small act of disrespect toward the hours of work nobody saw. By the early afternoon of a Saturday dinner party, a hostess had already been on her feet for hours, ironing the tablecloth, polishing silver that had not seen daylight since the last gathering, coordinating a roast that needed to rest exactly right. There was no live-in help doing this for her. By this point in American life, it was almost always her alone in that kitchen, which is exactly why punctuality mattered so much to the people who understood the cost of it. Money never touched the table, not the price of the roast, not what the new car cost, not a husband's raise. Etiquette writers of the era were blunt about it. Discussing dollars over dinner marked you as someone who had never been taught better. It sounds almost quaint now, but the rule protected something real, an evening where nobody had to feel smaller than the family across the table. This rule mattered more than it sounds, because a suburban dinner party often sat neighbors from genuinely different income brackets at the same table. A young engineer family beside an older couple who had paid off their mortgage years earlier. Silence on money was not stiffness. It was the thing that let both families sit as equals for one evening, judged only on conversation and warmth instead of a paycheck. Religion and politics were the two topics every etiquette book warned against by name, because a dinner party was built to bring near strangers together, not to pick a fight between them. A hostess who let the conversation drift into either one was considered to have lost control of her own room. The goal of the evening was never to win an argument. It was to make sure everyone left liking each other a little more than when they arrived. A skilled hostess kept a mental list of safe, warm subjects ready in her back pocket: a neighbor's new baby, a recent vacation, a funny story about the children. If a conversation started drifting toward dangerous ground, she would gently steer it back with a well-timed question to someone quiet at the far end of the table. It was a subtle skill, invisible when done well, and every good hostess practiced it like a craft. A nervous new hostess might be tempted to apologize the moment a dish came out slightly overdone, but the manuals were firm on this one point above almost any other: never apologize for your table. The moment you drew attention to a flaw, You forced every guest to either lie and reassure you or sit in awkward silence, and either way the evening's ease was broken. Confidence, not perfection, was the actual rule being taught. It is a strange thing to realize that the woman most people picture when they think of 1950s formality, stiff, silent, joyless, is largely a caricature that came later. The real women behind these rituals were often warm, funny, and deeply practical, running a whole evening on a shoestring budget with nothing but a library book and sheer determination to make their guests feel cared for. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. And this is a perfect example of it. The stereotype says these women were obsessed with material perfection, matching china and flawless roasts, but the actual guidance they read again and again told them the opposite, that composure mattered infinitely more than a slightly dry chicken. Warmth was the real skill being taught, not decoration. Reaching across another guest's plate to grab the butter yourself was considered almost clumsy enough to whisper about later. The correct move was so simple, it barely felt like a rule, you asked, quietly, for the dish to come to you. It kept elbows out of faces and kept the table looking like the calm, unhurried scene it was supposed to be, no matter how hungry anyone actually was. Nobody lifted a fork until the hostess herself picked hers up first, a small, silent signal that the meal had officially begun. Jump the gun, and you were eating alone in front of everyone. A strange little spotlight nobody wanted. It sounds like a tiny detail, but it turned every course into a shared moment instead of 12 people quietly racing through their own plates. This same logic ran through nearly every course of the meal, the hostess as the quiet conductor, setting the tempo without a single word spoken aloud. When she reached for the serving spoon, the table followed. When she set down her fork between bites, others noticed and slowed their own pace to match. It was choreography nobody rehearsed, and yet every experienced guest simply knew the steps. The napkin stayed folded across your lap for the entire meal, and dropping it onto the table early was read as an unspoken announcement that you were finished, whether you meant it or not. It only came up and got set beside the plate once the hostess herself signaled the meal was truly over. A napkin out of place too soon could genuinely fluster a room that was still 2 courses from dessert. There was a matching rule for the very start of the meal, too. The napkin only left the table and moved to a guest's lap once the hostess had done the same. Another quiet cue folded into a gesture nobody discussed out loud. Watching for it became second nature to a regular dinner party guest, one more small signal in a whole language of timing built entirely around the woman at the head of the table. Cigarettes were on nearly every table by this point, matched ashtrays set out like part of the china pattern, and lighting up between courses was completely ordinary. But there was still a rule attached. You offered the pack around the table before you lit your own, and a gentleman was expected to light a lady's cigarette for her. It was a norm of its time, not a health claim anyone was making, and it has simply vanished from how we gather now. It is worth remembering how much of a formal dinner rested on the humble roast itself, usually beef or a good ham, chosen because it could feed a crowd, hold its heat under a warming cover, and still look impressive when carried out on a platter. Getting that single dish right was often the difference between a hostess who felt in command of her evening and one who spent the whole night quietly worried. Looking back now, this is one of those details that lands harder than almost anything else on this list, precisely because it was so unremarkable then and so unthinkable now. A matched ashtray sat beside the water glass at nearly every formal table of the decade, treated as ordinary as a salt cellar. It is a small, striking reminder of how completely a culture's assumptions can shift within a single lifetime. Bringing a friend nobody invited was one of the fastest ways to unravel a hostess's careful math. Every seat at that table corresponded to a place card, a portion of roast, and a guest list she had thought through for days. Showing up with an extra person in tow was not generous. It was a burden dropped in her lap 5 minutes before dinner, and etiquette writers treated it as a real offense. Behind that rule sat a guest list, A hostess had often spent real thought balancing. A doctor's wife beside a school teacher, a shy new neighbor beside someone gregarious enough to draw her out. An uninvited extra did not just strain the food, it threw off a social arrangement she had planned like a puzzle. The correct move, and every etiquette writer said so plainly, was always to ask first. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and the etiquette of leaving a party is a perfect example. A good guest read the room for the hostess's quiet cues, a slowing conversation, coffee cleared away, and knew to rise before being asked. Overstaying was not just awkward, it kept a woman who had been on her feet since noon from finally sitting down in her own home. A truly considerate guest often took it a step further, offering a genuine hand with the dishes, or simply making the departure warm and unhurried rather than abrupt. The goal was never to leave the instant it became polite to do so, but to sense the natural close of the evening and honor it, leaving the hostess with the quiet satisfaction of a night that had gone exactly as long as it needed to. Gossiping about who wasn't at the table, or wondering aloud why a certain couple hadn't been invited, was considered genuinely poor form. It put the hostess in an impossible spot, forced to either defend her guest list or sit through an uncomfortable silence at her own party. The unwritten rule was simple. Whoever wasn't there stayed out of the conversation entirely. If a dish did not agree with you, the correct response was a small, polite, "No thank you," never a face, never a comment about the recipe. Making a visible show of distaste at someone's cooking was treated as a genuine breach, because a hostess had spent real hours over that stove, and a guest's job was never to critique, only to be gracious. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works at any table today. The place setting followed one unbending logic: outside in, forks on the left in the order you would use them, knives and spoons on the right. Dessert utensils waiting above the plate. Grab the wrong fork first, and a careful hostess noticed instantly. A small tell that you had not grown up around a table like this one. It was never really about the silverware. It was about showing a guest you belonged in the room. For a woman who had never grown up with a formal table herself, this single rule could take real practice to learn cold. She would set the table alone in the afternoon, quiet before guests arrived, checking the arrangement against a diagram in her etiquette book, determined that nobody walking in that evening would ever guess she had needed to check at all. A centerpiece mattered too. Usually fresh flowers cut that same afternoon, sometimes a simple arrangement from the yard rather than anything bought at real expense. Etiquette writers were clear that a centerpiece should never sit so tall guests could not see each other across it. A small practical rule with a very human reason behind it. Conversation always came first. A cocktail glass belonged in the room where it was poured, not wandering through the house from the living room to the hallway to the powder room. The cocktail hour itself was a fixed, named ritual by this point, usually running from around 5:30 until dinner was called. Carrying a drink from room to room struck the era as careless, the kind of small looseness a truly composed hostess, and her guests simply did not allow. The cocktail hour itself deserves a moment of its own, because it was practically a small ceremony built around a gleaming bar cart, a set of patented tools, and a short, specific menu of drinks a hostess was expected to know how to mix. It gave guests a full hour to settle in and warm up to each other before anyone sat down to eat, and it made the transition into dinner feel earned rather than rushed. Highballs, Manhattans, and the classic gin martini were the standard order of the evening, poured from a bar cart that had become almost as much a status object as the good china itself. None of this was about excess. It was about ritual, a fixed hour with a fixed rhythm that everyone understood, and a drink carried into the dining room signaled that rhythm had been broken. When a lady rose from the table, even briefly, the men seated near her were expected to rise too, a small physical courtesy repeated a dozen times over the course of an evening. It looks almost theatrical from here, but it was constant, automatic, and completely unremarkable to the people doing it. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, And gestures like this one were part of how she built it. Small gestures like this one were everywhere in the era's etiquette. A coat held open, a chair pulled out, a match struck before anyone had to ask. None of it was really about formality for its own sake. It was a language of attentiveness, a way of telling the people around you, without ever saying it out loud, that you had noticed them. Correcting someone's grammar, their pronunciation, or a small factual slip at the table was considered one of the rudest things a guest could do, worse in its way than any fork mistake. It embarrassed a person in front of a room they could not easily leave. The etiquette manuals were clear that being right was never worth making someone else feel small in their own social evening. Old grudges, unresolved arguments, anything left over from a previous gathering, stayed outside the front door. A dinner party was treated as a kind of clean slate for the evening, and dragging yesterday's disagreement back into tonight's conversation was seen as genuinely bad manners. The whole point of the ritual was momentum forward, a fresh, pleasant hour, not a rehash of old business. A thoughtful hostess never seated a married couple beside each other at a formal dinner on the theory that husbands and wives already talk to each other every night at home. The seating chart was built instead to mix guests, to spark new conversation, to make the evening feel bigger than the people who walked in already knowing each other. It was a small structural trick, and it worked exactly as intended. Building that seating chart was, in its own quiet way, an art form. A hostess would consider who talked too much and who needed drawing out, who had a shared hobby with a near stranger, who might genuinely enjoy meeting someone new. Done well, a guest could leave an evening having made a real friend they never would have met if she had simply let couples sit together out of habit. And the evening was not truly finished until a note arrived. Days later, handwritten, thanking the hostess by name for her table, her food, her effort. Skipping it was almost unthinkable, a debt left quietly unpaid. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, because nothing makes someone want to invite you back like knowing you noticed the work they put in. These notes were often kept tucked into a drawer or a scrapbook, small proof that an evening had mattered to someone beyond the night it happened. A hostess might reread 1 month later and remember exactly which guest had said what, which dish had been the one people asked about. It turned a single dinner into something with a longer life than just the hours it lasted. Dessert had its own small ceremony too, often carried in separately once the main course had been fully cleared, a signal that the evening was entering its final, relaxed stretch. Coffee followed in the living room rather than at the table itself, another shift in scenery that let the formal structure of dinner gently loosen into easier conversation before the night wound down. That closes out the full list of 20, but the story underneath it is really just getting started. Every rule we just walked through came from somewhere, taught by someone, defended by a small handful of books an entire generation of American women leaned on at once. A history worth understanding next, starting with the two names behind nearly all of it. A misconception worth clearing up right here, before we go any further. Watching a video like this, it is tempting to picture these rules as joyless, a cage of forks and napkins nobody actually enjoyed. But that is not what the record shows at all. The etiquette writers themselves warned against exactly that kind of stiffness, over and over, insisting that a warm host mattered infinitely more than a perfect one. It is worth pausing here to say why any of this mattered so much. Most of these young hostesses had grown up in the Depression, then the war, and now suddenly had a dining room of their own for the first time in their lives, with no mother or grandmother nearby to show them how it worked. The rulebook was not vanity. It was a lifeline, a way to walk into a room full of strangers and know exactly what to do next. Before the war, a family with any real means simply hired someone who already knew how to run a formal table. That entire arrangement had quietly disappeared by the post-war years, and the etiquette book became the substitute for the housekeeper who was no longer coming. Reading it cover to cover was, for many young wives, the closest thing they had to formal training for the role they had just stepped into. Two women's names sit behind almost every one of these rules. Emily Post had been teaching American manners since the early 1920s, and by the post-war years, her book was the closest thing the country had to a shared rulebook for the dinner table. She insisted again and again that hospitality mattered more than perfection, a message that got lost somewhere along the way to the stereotype we remember now. Post ran a syndicated newspaper column and even a radio program on manners, reaching women in towns and cities who would never have crossed paths with the old aristocratic circles her rules originally came from. By the time she passed away in 1960, her name had become something close to a household verb. To say a family had been Emily Posted about was simply understood. No further explanation needed. The second name was Amy Vanderbilt, who published her own guide in 1952, aimed squarely at the new suburban wife who had money and a dining room, but no old family tradition to lean on. Her book explained the rules from the ground up, patiently, without assuming you already knew them. For a huge number of first-time hostesses, her copy sat dog-eared on the kitchen counter, consulted before every single party. What set Vanderbilt apart was tone. Less a set of commandments handed down, and more a patient older sister explaining how things worked. She wrote for the woman who had genuine anxiety about hosting her husband's boss for the first time, and she gave that woman something practical to hold on to. A script for an evening that could otherwise feel like walking a tightrope in front of people whose opinion actually mattered to a career. It is easy to imagine these rules only applying to the wealthy, but that misses the real story entirely. This etiquette boom was a middle-class phenomenon through and through. Engineers and school teachers and insurance salesmen and their wives, all newly able to afford a home with a dining room, all reaching for the same handful of books to learn how to fill it properly. The good china sitting in that dining room almost always had a story of its own. Usually a wedding gift chosen from a registry at the local department store, saved for exactly this kind of evening and never touched for an ordinary family supper. That hard line between everyday dishes and good china was one every etiquette writer insisted on, and breaking it, using the good plates on a Tuesday, was its own small kind of carelessness. It is a small detail, but a telling one, that many of these etiquette rules were tested first in the writer's own life before they ever reached a printed page. Amy Vanderbilt hosted constantly, tried her own advice on Reel's guests, and revised her guidance across editions as American life kept changing around her. The rulebook was never static. It was a living document responding to a country that would not sit still. That good china was almost always hand-washed, too, gently, right after the guests had gone, since home dishwashers were still a luxury few kitchens actually had. It was less a rule about tradition than a plain fact of the decade, and it meant a hostess's evening did not really end when the last car pulled out of the driveway. It ended much later, standing at the sink with a soft cloth and a sink full of warm water. The bridge table deserves its own mention here, because for many of these families, a dinner party and an evening of bridge were essentially the same event. Couples would eat, then move to card tables set up in the living room, with its own quiet etiquette of partnering fairly, keeping score honestly, and never gloating over a win. It has almost entirely vanished from how we imagine 1950s entertaining, and it was everywhere. There is a quiet irony sitting underneath this entire story. The very decade that perfected the formal dinner party is also the decade that invented the thing that would eventually replace it, a frozen tray you could heat and eat alone in front of the television. Nobody at the time thought of it as the beginning of the end. It was just a convenience for a busy night. But it planted a seed that grew for 70 years. Television itself was the quiet disruptor nobody blamed at the time. By the late 50s, the glowing box in the living room had become the evening's real gravitational center in most American homes, pulling families inward instead of outward toward a neighbor's dining table. The dinner party did not vanish overnight, but the evenings it used to fill started getting fewer and further apart. None of this happened because the rules were foolish. It happened because life sped up, and a ritual built on unhurried evenings could not survive a culture that started praising convenience over ceremony. There is a real tenderness in knowing these women were not being fussy for its own sake. They were building something intentional in a world that was about to stop asking anyone to slow down. By the 1960s, the loosening had already begun. Backyard barbecues, buffet-style, come-as-you-are parties, casual gatherings that would have scandalized a strict post-reader a decade earlier. It was not a collapse so much as a slow unraveling, one relaxed rule at a time, until the formal seated dinner party became the exception rather than the expectation for an ordinary weekend. By the middle of the following decade, the fondue party and the backyard luau had become the new fashionable ways to entertain, playful and loud, where the old dinner party had been quiet and precise. It was still hospitality, still an evening built around a table, but the whole tone had shifted from ceremony toward fun, and the 20 rules we just covered started to feel like something from another century entirely. A new voice eventually rose to speak for the next generation, a columnist who would come to be known as Miss Manners, writing with a lighter, more flexible touch that explicitly pushed back against the rigid old rulebook. Her arrival marked the real cultural handoff, an acknowledgement that the strict Post and Vanderbilt era had ended and something looser had taken its place. It helps, too, to picture the sheer physical effort behind an evening like this, a woman moving between stove, table, and front hall for 6 or 7 straight hours, all while appearing completely unhurried to the people she was hosting. That invisible labor is easy to romanticize from a distance, and it deserves real respect rather than either dismissal or blind nostalgia. It was genuinely hard, skilled work. For decades after that, the formal dinner party mostly lived on in memory. In the stories, a mother told a daughter about the night she wore a particular dress, or the evening the roast came out perfectly, and everyone said so. It became less a living practice and more a kind of family folklore, passed down in fragments rather than followed as a full system anymore. And yet, here we are, decades later, and something has clearly shifted back toward wanting this world again. Vintage tablescapes fill social media, old china patterns are being hunted down at estate sales for real money, and a whole audience of viewers has started asking the same question, quietly, in comment sections everywhere. What did we actually lose when we stopped doing this? Part of the answer is simple, and it has nothing to do with forks or napkins at all. What we lost was a guaranteed evening of undivided attention, a stretch of hours where nobody's phone buzzed, nobody streamed anything, and the only entertainment in the room was the actual people sitting in it. That is a much harder thing to recreate than a place setting, and it is exactly why this list still matters. It also helps to remember these women were not naive about hard times. Many of them had rationed sugar during the war, stretched a grocery budget through years of genuine scarcity, and still chose, once they finally had a little more, to spend that extra effort on other people rather than just themselves. The dinner party was a form of generosity dressed up as a set of rules. None of these rules required real money to follow, and that is worth sitting with for a second. Answering an invitation promptly costs nothing. Waiting for the hostess to lift her fork costs nothing. A handwritten note costs a stamp. The entire system was, at its core, a way of showing respect that had almost nothing to do with what anyone could afford. That is really the thread running through all 20 of these rules, whether it is the outside in fork order or the note written days later. Every single one exists to protect someone else's feelings, the hostess's effort, the quiet guest's comfort, the absent friend's reputation. Manners in this era were never really about looking correct. They were a discipline of thinking of other people first. It is worth noticing, too, how much of this ran on trust that was never spoken aloud. Nobody handed a guest a printed rule card at the door. A young couple simply absorbed it from a mother, a book, a careful older neighbor who explained the fork order once and never had to again. That kind of shared, unspoken knowledge is genuinely hard to build today, when so few of us learned any version of it at all. Think back for a moment to that young hostess frozen in the doorway from the very start of this video, napkin still in her hand. What she was really afraid of was never a single broken rule. It was the idea that she might let someone down in her own home on an evening she had spent all week preparing. That fear and the care behind it is the real heart of everything we just walked through. The parlor remembers, even when we forget, and that is really the whole reason to look back at a list like this one. These 20 rules were never really about forks or napkins. They were about a woman deciding that an ordinary Tuesday night deserved real care, and about a room full of near strangers leaving a little closer than when they arrived. If you take only one of these 20 and bring it back into your own life, let it be the thank you note. It is the smallest gesture on this entire list, and somehow the one with the longest memory attached to it. The kind of thing a friend keeps in a drawer for 30 years and pulls out on a quiet afternoon just to feel remembered. So the next time you set a table, even a simple one, think about the fork order, the folded napkin, the note you might write afterward. None of it takes long, and all of it still works exactly the way it did 70 years ago. If tonight's video brought back a memory of your own mother's table, tell me about it in the comments. I would love to hear it. And I will see you at the next parlor gathering.